60 years ago, Pope Paul VI declared that the Catholic Church is proud to have glorified and liberated woman. And in the course of the centuries, in her diversity of characters, and have brought into relief her equality with man. Almost 40 years ago, Pope John Paul II declared that the Church gives thanks for all the manifestations of the feminine genius which have appeared in history, and for all the charisms which the Holy Spirit has distributed to women throughout the history of the people of God. And today, in AD 2025, I'm encountering all over the country Catholics of all ages, states of life, and levels of formation and education by Catholic institutions who are shocked, and I mean truly shocked, to learn that Catholic women have any significant history to speak of. Apart from a few isolated examples, such as the sudden flash-fire burstings in and out again of history's pages of our most famous female mystics. Since I was a girl growing up in a devout Catholic family, I've heard numerous general messages from Catholic leaders about the feminine genius, about the dignity of woman. I've at times received from them too reverent portraits of a fairly narrow group of biblical women and widely venerated female saints such as Thérèse of Lisieux. But when it comes to what I today know, write, and teach others about respecting the great variety of compelling and inspiring women in Catholic history, and respecting too how integral so many have been to central chapters of our Church's history, well, most of this I've had to seek to learn outside the pale of institutionalized Catholicism. I suspect there are many here, and who will also tune into our conference online, who also have heard a lot about femininity in the abstract from Catholic sources, but have learned relatively little over the years about our actual foremothers in the faith. And so for this reason, and also because most of you don't have the luxury of digging into specialized resources in this area as I do by trade, I thought I'd devote this lecture to telling you about a range of remarkable but too little known women who helped to shape our Church's wonderfully deep, rich, and complex history. And I will then close with some of my own general thoughts on the feminine genius and Catholic history. In keeping with one of the most ancient traditions of Christian history telling, I'll begin with some martyrs. And I'd like to tell you first about Saint Blandina, a 2nd century martyr whose story was preserved for us by the first major church historian, Eusebius of Caesarea. By the way, Eusebius's ecclesiastical history was first translated into English in the 16th century by a woman, by Mary Bassett, a granddaughter of St. Thomas More and daughter of Margaret More Roper. Isn't that something? Blandina's name isn't included with those of Saints Felicity, Perpetua, and other female martyrs in the Roman canon, so most Catholics have never heard of her, let alone learned that she was just one of numerous women and men killed in the Roman persecutions of the followers of Jesus prior to when the Roman emperors embraced Christianity in the 4th century. Blandina was a slave, and she was imprisoned for her faith at the age of 15 in 177 AD. And her persecutor was a military commander in the Roman province of Gaul, what is today France. According to Eusebius, Blandina faced questioning by Roman officials with fortitude. She also encouraged other Christians imprisoned with her, male and female, to insist on their innocence when accused of cannibalism and incest, which were crimes often imputed to Christians in this period. Although a very simple gesture of honoring the Roman gods alongside our one true God could have saved her life, Blandina endured brutal torture in an amphitheater. Refusing again to acknowledge the Roman gods, she was stabbed to death after being scourged, burned on a grate, and attacked by an angry steer. I'd like to jump forward many centuries to the early modern period, which is my main period of expertise. when other women similarly gave their lives in fidelity to Christ, but in contexts where Protestant authorities attempted to coerce them into accepting their ideas and ways. While many Catholics today know of the courage with which the aforementioned Thomas More faced his trial and execution at the hands of King Henry VIII's regime, many Catholics are unaware that some of the bravest Catholics of the same period were English women who suffered greatly during the reign of Henry's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. 3 of them were canonized 50 years ago. First, St. Margaret Clitheroe was a young wife and mother of 3, as well as a Protestant convert to Catholicism, while her husband remained Protestant. And she was arrested several times in her home city of York. She was targeted for not attending Protestant services and for hiding Catholic priests who offered the true Mass secretly in her home. Upon her final arrest, Clitheroe refused to plead either innocent or guilty, rejecting the very legitimacy of the arrest. She was then crushed to death in public on Good Friday of 1586 while pregnant with her 4th child. Second, Margaret Ward of Cheshire, St. Margaret Ward of Cheshire, was an unmarried woman in her 30s when she was arrested, tortured, and hanged at Tyburn in 1588 after helping a priest escape from prison. She refused to disclose his whereabouts during rounds of severe torture. She also refused to attend a Protestant service when simply doing so would have saved her life. 5 faithful laymen were martyred alongside her. Third, St. Anne Lyne, after converting to Catholicism with her husband, harbored priests to ensure that the true Mass was available to Catholics in Essex. Lyne was eventually arrested and hanged in 1601 at the age of 37. But before she was killed, she reportedly said to the crowd around her scaffold, "I am sentenced to die for harboring a Catholic priest, and so far I am from repenting for having done so, that I wish with all my soul that where I have entertained one, I could have entertained 1,000. Some seminarians I told that story to agreed that she's a based woman of 1601. I'm glad that mostly female audience laughs at that too. There are numerous other female Catholic martyrs to speak of, each with unique stories, including many killed in our own time. But I'd like to tell you now about some brave women from our church's history that we Catholics tend to hear even less about. Ones who were quite willing to suffer martyrdom, but who survived to serve the church in other ways. Some excellent historical scholarship has appeared on this subject, such as Carrie Klaus's critical edition for Chicago University Press of the Poor Clare nun Jeanne de Jussy, who wrote A Short Chronicle, which is a first-hand account of the violent Protestant takeover of Geneva shortly before the reformer John Calvin's arrival there. This resource illustrates the sort of persecution that Catholic nuns who refused to disband in newly Protestant settings sometimes suffered. The highlighted Poor Clares of Geneva were, by 1530, thanks to the protection they had from their cloister walls and from armed priests who helped guard them, they were at the center of the Catholic resistance in Geneva after the city's bishop had fled to a safer place. As various churches and other monastic buildings shut down after mobs attacked their sacred images, sacred vessels, and reserved blessed Eucharistic hosts, the Poor Clares Church was for several years the only place where Catholics remaining in Geneva could attend Mass. The priests who offered Mass there had to travel to and from the convent dressed as laymen, with weapons on their person, and the nuns, 24 of them at the time, faced constant abuse by men who tried to get them to convert or leave, sometimes by shouting Bible verses at them or singing vulgar songs to them at the convent walls. The Poor Clares of Geneva were led in this period by an elderly mother abbess named Louise Rambo. That's right, Mother Abbess Rambo. History is better than fiction, I keep trying to tell my students. From Sister Jean's A Short Chronicle, we learn that not only Mother Abbess Rambo and the other nuns, but also many ordinary Catholic laywomen who were close to them were among the city's bravest people. Quote, this is Sister Jeanne who wrote the short chronicle. Many heretical men in Geneva had good Catholic wives who, to defend the holy religion, suffered worse than martyrs because they were severely beaten and tortured by their own loved ones when they refused to renounce their religion. Women, she went on, were always found to be much more steadfast and constant in their religion than men. One young Genevan girl was banished from her home by her own father and forced to become a servant elsewhere when she would not abandon the Catholic faith. Furthermore, some young women were, during Holy Week in 1535, thrown into a prison by their husbands for the same reason. But they managed to escape through a narrow window and attend Holy Week liturgies at the Poor Clare convent. Sadly, a mob finally broke into the convent and destroyed almost every sacred thing in sight in August of 1535. The Poor Clares finally had to leave Geneva. Mother Abbess Rambaud and the others walked 25 miles south to Annecy, where the Duke of Savoy gave them a new monastic home. The community, though, for centuries called themselves the Sisters of St. Clare of Geneva in Refuge in Annecy, never forgetting Geneva as their true home. Even more sadly, that faithful community was finally suppressed in 1793 by French revolutionary fanatics. In this context of church history, more women faced the prospect of martyrdom bravely. This was the case with the 16 discalced Carmelites of Compiègne, who were guillotined in front of a mob in Paris on July 17, 1794. These women, the Carmelites of Compiègne, were finally canonized this past Christmas Eve by Pope Francis. Hopefully, we will see now more such women canonized, such as the martyred Daughters of Charity of Arras, who were guillotined in June 1794, after they had remained together to serve the needy, even when their bishop and other local clergymen had fled France, and after an ex-priest attempted but failed to pressure them into swearing an oath of loyalty to the new regime. But many Catholic women willing to face martyrdom in revolutionary France survived to serve the church in other ways. Many were ordinary peasants and townswomen who resisted government efforts to force a counterfeit version of the Mass on their parishes and who harbored non-oath-swearing priests, sometimes against the wishes of husbands, fathers, and brothers who urged compliance with the new regime. There were also determined nuns who survived the revolution and embraced new trials to help restore some of the great contemplative monastic heritage of France. For example, the discalced Carmelite Camille de Soyecourt, who was imprisoned during the Revolution and lost many loved ones to the guillotine, lived not only to raise her orphan nephew, but also to tangle with no less a man than Napoleon Bonaparte in order to refound, against his wishes, the discalced Carmelites all over France after the revolutionary suppression. She long outlived Napoleon, dying at 91. Nuns apparently live the longest. Is that true? Maybe some of the sisters can confirm that. She died at 91 after witnessing 2 more French revolutions. Although Soyecourt's cause for canonization stalled in the early 20th century, it seems that without her efforts, the most famous French Carmelite of all, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, might never have had a French Carmelite community to join in the first place. The Church owes many famous things, in part to many women who are largely forgotten today. One of these things, if I can jump back in time a bit again, is the 7th Ecumenical Council of the Church, and the last to be recognized by the churches of both the East and the West. Indeed, we owe the Second Council of Nicaea considerably to the persistence and leadership of Irene of Athens, the ruler of the Byzantine Empire in the late 8th century. After selecting a man named Tarasios to serve as the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, Irene convened with him, not with the Pope, who stayed home but sent his blessings, the Second Council of Nicaea. Empress Irene furthermore presided over the final session in 787, that pronounced definitively for the universal church on the matter of how images of Christ, his mother, saints, and angels could be employed in Christian worship, something that had been terribly dividing Christians in the East to the point of violence for decades. For more about her, I recommend historian Judith Herron's book, Unrivaled Influence, published by Princeton. Now, several centuries later, another Christian empress contributed in important ways to the Cluniac Reform, the most famous monastic reform movement in church history prior to the post-Reformation efforts of St. Teresa of Avila and other Catholic leaders of the 16th and 17th centuries. I'm referring to St. Adelaide of Italy. I've learned most of what I know about her from a historian named Penelope Nash in a book published by Palgrave Macmillan. St. Adelaide's 10th century life could make for a great film. She was married off young to a man who became the King of Italy. She then refused, as a 20-year-old mother of a baby girl, the advances, or rather efforts, to join himself to her great wealth and the throne of Italy, of an Italian nobleman more than twice her age, who probably murdered her husband. Historians still don't know for sure. She then was thrown into prison by that same fellow after he couldn't charm her, but then escaped from prison with the help of a swashbuckling priest. And then she quickly married the recently widowed and apparently much more charming King of the Germans, the man eventually remembered as Otto the Great, after she had proposed to him, not vice versa. That was before Sadie Hawkins dances. Adelaide chose wisely, proposing to Otto. While bringing into the world and raising several more children, Adelaide not only went on to see Otto come to dominate Italy militarily and be crowned as Holy Roman Emperor by Pope John XII. What a guy. But she also went on to be papally consecrated. She was consecrated by the Pope alongside him in an unprecedented way, as Holy Roman Empress and co-ruler of Otto's empire. She used this papally sanctioned power to found and protect ecclesiastical institutions in a time of chronic warfare. And back to my point, she helped to reform lax and corrupt monasteries as an indispensable friend of two saintly Benedictine abbots, Maiolus and Odilo of Cluny. She went on to favor the larger Cluniac reform as regent and then Empress Dowager during her son Otto II's reign, and even more so when governing the Holy Roman Empire as regent for her grandson Otto III. There are numerous other royal, and in some cases also canonized or beatified, royal women from Adelaide's time onward, whose contributions to the Church's history could fill many volumes and in some cases have already begun to. But I want to turn here to a non-royal laywoman of the 17th century, and one who is extremely important to me because she got me into the study of women in Catholicism's history in the first place, even though I was reluctant at first to do so, something I will get back to later. I'm speaking of the subject of my 2023 biography for Pegasus Books, La Duchesse. Marie de Vignerot, the Duchess of Aiguillon, was a French noblewoman who lived from 1604 to 1675, and she was the niece and right hand of King Louis XIII's powerful First Minister of State, Cardinal Richelieu, whom most people know, if they know him at all, from fictional caricatures such as the Three Musketeers. The real Cardinal Richelieu flouted all convention and made his niece Marie, not her living brother, who was a disaster of a man, the heiress of one of the largest fortunes in all of Europe. He gave her to, rather than to his official successors in high office, privileged possession of his political papers and special access to the vast network of political clients that he had built up over the years. My book, La Duchesse, is the first modern book about this woman and could also be the basis of an amazing film or series. Hint, hint, if anyone has connections. Although I won't highlight here all the reasons I think that, I will say at least that the Duchess of Aiguillon was acknowledged and praised by the Pope and other leading churchmen and statesmen of the 17th century as one of the most influential Catholic leaders of the age. This is because she chose to employ much of what Richelieu entrusted to her to serve the church above all, and on a great international scale. For example, she established throughout France numerous religious communities, male and female, of diverse orders. She also established and helped to sustain schools, missions to the poor, including many of her good friends St. Vincent de Paul's missions, evangelistic missions in North Africa, the Middle East, and Madagascar, and even entire missionary dioceses, as well as charitable ministries in Asia and North America. She took active parts in selecting bishops for the church in France and for the new missionary diocese, and she was regularly consulted by the rulers of France and princes of the church on a host of matters. At the same time, she was a leading figure in a variety of French political, social, and cultural arenas, including as a major patroness of artists, scholars, and authors of books on subjects such as, it just so happens, the history of women in the church and the equal moral and spiritual dignity of women and men. She was mostly forgotten, though, by modern times. Where remembered at all over the past 2 centuries, it has been in distorted ways, either as a retiring pious widow who had been moved emotionally by the charisma of priests such as Vincent de Paul to donate to projects characterized as the fruit of entirely their initiative, or, thanks largely to the novelist Alexandre Dumas, she was caricatured as a mantilla-wearing drip in public who fainted at the slightest whiff of immorality, but also as a minimally clad, sighing sexpot behind closed doors. And this is why I do not want HBO buying the rights to my story. To this day, the few French people who know her name tend to think of a woman more like that than like the remarkable internationally influential Catholic leader that she was. The Duchess of Aiguillon falls into another category of lesser-known women of the Church's history that I want to highlight in this lecture: patronesses and foundresses of innovative Catholic institutes and communities. One of the financial pillars of the Discalced Carmelites in France, as they were first spreading and growing as an order in that country, she was also a driving force behind and one of the first presidents of the original Ladies of Charity, one of the most innovative social charitable lay-run organizations in the history of the Church. And she established the first community of missionary hospital nuns ever sent overseas from Europe, the Augustinian hospital nuns, who were active in colonial Quebec beginning in 1639. On this point, there's a myth perpetuated, for example, by the recent film Cabrini, that St. Francis Xavier Cabrini's congregation was, in the late 19th century, the first female congregation involved in a serious way in overseas missions. Familiarity with Catholic history, even at a basic level, demonstrates how erroneous that is. The Duchess and other women she knew, such as Saint Jean de Chantal and Louise de Marillac, were conscious of being part of a long and living tradition of female foundresses and supporters of innovative new religious institutes and communities. Today's Catholics could stand to become more conscious of this same tradition, which developed by leaps and bounds from the 17th century onward. I'd like to highlight just a handful of women in this tradition now. In 1606, a young Englishwoman named Mary Ward left her homeland at the age of 21 because she felt called to a religious vocation, but she could not pursue one in Protestant England. To remind you, this was just 5 years after the based St. Anne Lyne's martyrdom. Inspired by the example of the Jesuits to pursue a more active ministry than was possible in the women's orders then open to her because of the law on the Council of Trent that Angela referred to earlier, she and some companions established a new congregation in 1609. They were drawn especially to the education of girls, at a time when there were few formal schools for girls anywhere, and they began opening girls' schools modeled partly on the Jesuit schools for boys, which were already very numerous by then. Soon known as the Sisters of Loretto, Mary Ward's congregation soon operated schools all over Europe, in what are today Belgium, Germany, Austria, Italy, and France. Over time, the Sisters of Loretto enjoyed the support of powerful Catholic rulers, male and female. They also had the support of some leading churchmen. However, Ward and her Sisters of Loretto were mocked by others as, quote, galloping girls and lady Jesuits. And some Jesuits were concerned that they were trying to become a female branch of the Society of Jesus, something forbidden in the Jesuits' constitutions, since their experimental inclusion of women in the 1540s, which people often don't know about, failed to work out to St. Ignatius's satisfaction. In 1631, the Jesuit general secured a temporary suppression of the Sisters of Loretto from Pope Urban VIII, who insisted that their instruction of girls outside of cloister walls was unsuited to, quote, the weakness of the female sex, intellect, and womanly modesty. Ironically, though, Ward was able to establish a new community in her home country of England, which she had once had to leave to become a nun, because the Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria, was now influencing matters there during the reign of her Anglican husband, Charles I, who would sadly soon lose his kingdom and his head to Puritan fanaticism, in part because he let his Catholic wife have influence. Furthermore, the Sisters of Loretto were eventually approved by a later pope, Benedict XIV, but not until 1749, more than a century after Ward's death. Her order would eventually spread throughout the world, including to India, where the future Saint Teresa of Calcutta was among their number between the years 1929 and 1948. 2 centuries after Mary Ward's time lived another important but not widely known Catholic foundress, and one who was married. This was Juliette Colbert Faletti di Barolo, whose cause has been open at the Vatican since 2015. Having survived the French Revolution while losing an aunt and a grandmother to the guillotine, she left France after marrying an Italian nobleman who was visiting the country. She chose wisely, too. This man, Carlo Faletti di Baroli, had wine vineyards in Italy. He took her to Turin. His family produced some of the early vintages of Barolo wine, one of Italy's most famous reds. After failing to have children, they devoted themselves to assisting poor children, prisoners, unwed mothers, and victims of child prostitution. Juliette and Carlo indeed opened free schools and houses of refuge and engaged in other ministries together. They also founded the Sisters of St. Anne, a congregation devoted to nurturing neglected children, and they heroically assisted victims of cholera when an epidemic swept through their region. Sadly, Carlo died after contracting this disease. After this, the widowed Juliette became a secular Franciscan and helped to found another congregation, the Daughters of Jesus the Good Shepherd. The 19th century was an extremely fertile time in the church for new women's congregations, including ones dedicated to overseas mission work. Again, to correct the record where Cabrini is concerned. One foundress of such a congregation is Saint Émilie de Villars. Employing her own inheritance and family connections, she established the Sisters of St. Joseph of the Apparition, who were active in early French colonial Algeria by 1835, and who labored in other parts of North Africa and the Middle East in the decades thereafter. Although she has been canonized a saint, she's been canonized since 1951, I, for one, have never heard her name mentioned a single time in any Catholic setting. And I only know about her because I once stumbled across her story in an Oxford University Press book by historian Sarah Curtis. That book tells of other interesting 19th century female missionaries, including Blessed Anne Marie Javouy, who founded the Sisters of St. Joseph of Cluny even earlier in 1807, and traveled to Madagascar in 1817. Javouy and her sisters and the sisters of her congregation did missionary work too in French Senegal, Réunion Island, British Gambia, and Sierra Leone. Javouy was among the first Catholic leaders to advocate and work toward the creation of an indigenous African clergy in French colonial settings. Furthermore, she crossed the Atlantic to Guyana, where she and more than 30 sisters founded the Mana settlement, in which Black people freed from slavery were assisted in making new, sustainable livelihoods. Her work won her enemies, including within the church, but some churchmen who worked with her called her the Bartolomé de las Casas and Francis Xavier of their time. She was beatified in 1950. The final woman that I'd like to highlight today, who was the major patroness of an innovative missionary organization for both men and women, is an Englishwoman named Mary Elizabeth Herbert, who lived from 1822 to 1911. There is no good book about her yet, so I've actually begun a project about her and a whole circle of other women in the British Catholic Revival, which I hope will grow into a book. The missionary organization to which she gave critical support was St. Joseph's College at Mill Hill outside of London, along with its affiliated Society of Apostolic Life and Missionary Ventures in various countries. The progenitor of the Mill Hill Seminary, Society, and Missions was Herbert's dear friend, father, and later Cardinal Herbert Vaughan, whose decades of correspondence with Lady Herbert survive and demonstrate at every turn how crucial her support was from the late 1860s through the early 20th century. Part of a new era of English Catholic clergy and religious joining into global missionary activity in the 19th century, the Mill Hill priests, brothers, and sisters, in time with Vaughan and Herbert's encouragement, labored among marginalized African Americans in the United States, war refugees and epidemic victims in South Asia, and many other suffering communities in Africa, Europe, and Oceania. Lady Herbert interests me for these reasons and many more. Having stumbled across her name by accident one day, I discovered after some digging that she was the author, editor, and translator of numerous books on a variety of Catholic themes. She was also a convert from Anglicanism, a good close friend of St. John Henry Newman, a major philanthropist in both her Anglican and Catholic days, the friend of several prime ministers, an avid traveler around the Mediterranean, a baroness with courtly connections and an active social life, a woman of dynamic personality who was immortalized as characters in several Victorian novels, the wife of Queen Victoria's war secretary in the era of the Crimean War, and amid all of that, the mother of 7 children, including a son who became an ambassador to the United States during Teddy Roosevelt's administration. I've since learned, too, that Mary Elizabeth Herbert threw herself into her work alongside Cardinal Vaughan, which further included developing and writing for New English Catholic periodicals after suffering 2 tragedies related to her children. After she became a Catholic as a young widow, the British government, at the request of her late husband's family, took her children out of her care to prevent them from being influenced by her new faith. Just a few years later, she also suffered the death of her son William when he was only 16. He had joined the Navy, and he and 500 others perished at sea when the HMS Captain capsized. I was quite moved once I realized the timing of these tragedies in relation to Lady Herbert's most notable accomplishments for the Church. These accomplishments, I should add, include having done all she could for the Catholic population in and around Salisbury, her late husband's and his anti-Catholic family's home city, and one that had been a jewel of Catholic England prior to the Reformation. Among other things that she did there was to set up an industrial school and boarding school for poor and working class girls, to help teach them economically valuable skills in a safe community environment. When I consider all there is to write and still find out in the archives, and old books about Lady Herbert and countless other remarkable Catholic women in history, I laugh at myself that I was once reluctant to get into this field. I'm sorry to have to say, though, that I had been led by some of my Catholic formation to assume that there wasn't much of real historical interest to be discovered or written about in this area. I loved and still love and venerate John Paul II dearly, and I read his 1995 letter to women as a student a few years after it came out. And I took to heart lines such as these, that the genius of woman, for the most part, had developed and contributed to human progress in, quote, an inconspicuous way, and that, quote, very little of women's achievements in history can be registered by the science of history, unquote. In an Angelus reflection from the same period, Pope John Paul II called for histories that are written in a less one-sided way. Very admirable, less focused on men, that is. He insisted, too, though, that to do this, we need to stop focusing on extraordinary events and achievements and shift focus to the, quote, frequently silent, mostly social and cultural contributions of women in the sphere of daily life. The implication here is that the history of women of the Church is mostly a consideration of almost ahistorical, largely undocumented manifestations of feminine genius, while that of men of the Church gets to remain what it always was, the study of documented deeds, words, and legacies of the great, and I would add of the notably holy, faithful, courageous, and so on. In short, the most traditional subjects of the historical discipline. As a young person drawn to history, I was interested in understanding my church's relationship to major past political events and significant cultural and social developments. So I chose to focus my first major project on a group of people whom both my church teachers, who I respected, such as John Paul II, and ironically, some of the more radical feminists I reluctantly learned from at Harvard and Yale, were telling me occupied mostly alone center stage in such areas, i.e., men. And the particular men that I chose to study and write about were Jesuit missionaries. The most unexpected thing happened, though, while I was working on my Yale dissertation, which became my first book, Apostles of Empire. The 17th century Jesuits themselves, as I began reading them on their own terms, told me how important various women, French and Native American alike, were to their missions in North America. Contrary to so much of what I had been formed by various Catholic and feminist sources alike to think about their era, especially about Catholic clergymen of their time, they often spoke of some women as partners and even at times as people they deferred to and received invaluable protection from, as was the case with the Duchess of Aiguillon. Indeed, it was these 17th century Jesuits who introduced her to me. The sources of Catholic history, once we really begin to read them closely, are full of surprises like this that should not, frankly, be such surprises to us Catholics of all people at this stage of our Church's life here on earth. Chroniclers of the Church's past from every century have been telling us in all sorts of ways, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes enthusiastically, about the deeds, words, and legacies of numerous great and notably holy, courageous, and faithful women who, alongside all the men, can help us to better understand what the Church has been in the past and why she is the way she is now. They also, to be sure, often highlight and exaggerate even particular feminine virtues they exhibited in ways that sometimes seem to anticipate our discourses today about the feminine genius. But our pre-modern and early modern Catholic antecedents were also at times quite ready to praise certain great Catholic women as, quote, manly in their courage, or for stepping up and accomplishing things where the men around them either were failing out of cowardice or worldliness, or were absent due to war, their youth, sickness, or death. And they left us with mountains of evidence, a lot of it now neglected in old books and archives, of countless, compelling, inspiring, and incredibly diverse ways our foremothers in the faith served God and the Church in every age. And much of the deeper true history of our Catholic forefathers awaits still to be told adequately, I would add, in not a few cases because many of their stories also have been neglected, but even more so because all of their stories are incomplete without fuller reference to the women that stood in all sorts of relationships to them. For various reasons, though, most Catholics today are little exposed to the vast historical heritage at our fingertips, let alone formed to reflect patiently on the many things our forebears have to tell us. This past year, I've been engaging with Catholics all over the country about my book, Women of the Church, which weaves together the stories of more than 360 different, I counted, 360 different women, because people kept mentioning the one saint that I didn't write about. So that's another story, which weaves together the stories of more than 360 different women and groups of women from all centuries of Catholicism's past. And I keep getting asked different versions of the same questions, along the lines of which women that you've studied stand out as illustrating the feminine genius, or seem to illustrate feminine virtues such as receptivity and sensitivity, and so on. I greatly appreciate where such questions come from, but they also give me pause, too. It's almost as if we Catholics have become intellectually formed less to want to learn in a patient and contemplative way new lessons from our Catholic history than to want to proof text from it, to take convenient snippets from it, usually out of context, to underline, say, a predefined interpretation of a particular modern papal teaching or phrase like the feminine genius, or to quickly advance this or that predetermined, pressing, activistic, evangelistic, or social goal. So I've become ambivalent, I want to confess to this audience in particular, about the often repeated phrase, the feminine genius. Partly because it seems at times to get in the way of more direct and open-ended encounters with real historical Catholic women who have things to tell us, all of us, male as well as female, not simply in their putatively feminine aspects, but more universally as fellow human beings and Christians, and more individually as prospective friends in our own just as unique pilgrimages into Christ's kingdom. I am now committed to doing more work on the history of women of the Church, but not because I want to underscore, as if it's both the beginning and the end of why they matter, where they may very well manifest the feminine genius. Rather, I'm committed to reminding my fellow Catholics, with the world beyond our church, that women have always been at the heart of Catholic history alongside men, and because it is in keeping with the cardinal virtue of justice to restore them to the chapters of that history where our own Catholic forebears, male and female, left to us all kinds of evidence that they belong in those chapters. I'm grateful for the attention that I'm receiving for women of the Church, which, let me be clear, has been leading to many wonderful conversations and invitations such as the very warm welcome that I'm receiving here at this podium today. But I actually also hope for a day when books like that one are less needed and actually look like a relic of a time when we Catholics finally began to realize that we have a lot more of our own history in general to learn and research further, write better books about from a confidently, positively Catholic point of view, and communicate more effectively about both to our young and to a world that badly needs the wisdom of Catholic experience, together with the other treasures pouring forth from the heart of Holy Mother Church. Thank you.